to our session, our practice session, which I obviously needed because I had myself on mute when I started that whole intro. So this week is Holy Week. We're going from Palm Sunday, which was yesterday, to Easter, which is next Sunday. And the commemoration of Holy Week in the New Testament is based off of the Jewish holiday of Passover, which itself commemorates the plagues of Egypt right before the Exodus, and then the protection that the children of Israel had as they were brought through those plagues and redeemed by God. So again, if you unfamiliar with where that is, that's in Exodus chapter 7 chapter 7 through 11. And we see those 10 plagues that are going to occur there, and we're going to talk about those today. And at the end of that is the death of the firstborn. And the Lord said to Israel at that time that they had to slaughter a lamb and take the blood of the lamb and paint it over the doorway. And that way the angel of death that was going to be passing through would go over their houses and not take any of their children. And that would give a distinction between the firstborn of Israel and the firstborn of Egypt. Since we're living in the time of coronavirus with our own tour of isolation in our homes, I thought this would be a very appropriate practice passage for us to have, since we're also coming up on Easter. So this Wednesday, the 8th, will be the first day of Passover for this year in 2020, and of course on Sunday will be Easter. Usually those align. There's a couple of years ago they didn't align, but I thought this would be a nice little meditation for us to begin our session on. So let's turn. You don't have to really turn in your Bible, but you can if you're taking notes, this is when you want to get your pen out and start going. So again, in chapters 7 through 11 of the book of Exodus, we see the 10 plagues of Egypt. And so I'm going to tell you what they are, just in case you don't have your Bible ready with you. So the first plague was that the water is turned to blood. So God commands Moses to go down to the river Nile and to strike it with his staff. And when he does so, the water of the Nile turns to blood and cannot be consumed. It's not drinkable. And then the second plague is the plague of frogs, that a few days later, frogs came up out of the river and entered into every house and every home of the Egyptians. Then they died, and then they had to sort of sweep them all up and throw them outside. The third plague is the plague of lice, that the Egyptians and their livestock were overwhelmed with this plague of lice that was covering them, making it very irritable and itchy for all of them. The fourth plague is kind of interesting. I'm going to pause here with this one. It's sometimes translated the plague of flies, or sometimes in some translations translated the plague of wild beasts, and that's because of the underlying Hebrew word. So the Hebrew word there is arov, which actually means mixture or confusion, sort of like everything kind of jumbled up together. And so we don't really know what the arov plague is, and so there are different options we can go with it. I'm going to go with wild beasts or confusion because of what I'm going to parallel it with tonight with our reflection on the Holy Week. So the fifth plague is the plague of diseased livestock, that all of the cattle of Egypt had a disease that was afflicting them, and many of them died. The sixth plague, so now we're up to 6, was the plague of boils, which afflicted all of the Egyptians. So they were so afflicted by it that even the Egyptians couldn't really come out of their houses and see each other. The Pharaoh and his magicians were not able to have an audience together. That's significant because the earlier plagues, we see that the magicians of Egypt were able to do some tricks themselves and simulate the plagues as well. That's very important to the narrative of Exodus with the interaction between Moses and the magicians. Now the magicians cannot heal themselves of the boils, so now we're definitely knowing that these are miraculous plagues that are not just magic tricks. So then the seventh plague is the plague of hail, that a storm came up over all of Egypt and rained down hail and destroyed all of their crops. And this is one of the first ones, well, in all of them, Israel was protected. But here, the land of Goshen, where the Israelites lived, was not affected by the storm. Only the Nile Delta, where the Egyptians lived, did we have this hailstorm, this major thunderstorm. The eighth plague is the plague of locusts. And again, if the hail had not already destroyed all of their crops, then this swarm of locusts coming from the sea, probably from the east as well, destroyed all the remaining crops. And so now Egypt has no food left for them to eat, right? So this is a major point in the book of Exodus, is that we see, particularly in Genesis, when we have Joseph, that Egypt is very concerned with having enough food to provide for their people. And so the idea that God has now destroyed their crops and is going to bring famine is already a major judgment upon them. So the ninth plague is the plague of darkness. And again, where the Egyptians lived, we have darkness for 3 whole days, but in the land of Goshen, there is no major darkness. So we have, again, a distinction between Egypt and Israel, or Goshen, at this time. And then finally, the 10th plague of Exodus is the plague of the first, or the death of the firstborn, right? So, and again, like I said before, the command was for them to sacrifice a lamb and to eat that lamb in their household, paint the doorway with blood, and that would protect them against the death plague. And the next morning, they get up, and there's much wailing and mourning in Egypt, because every household of the Egyptians had lost their firstborn son, and none of the Israelite households had done that. And of course, this then precipitates the Exodus. After this, Pharaoh tells Israel, "You can now go, get out of my land, take all of your people with you. I want you to be done." Okay, so those 10 plagues of Exodus are what we are then commemorating during the Passover, right? Particularly the death of the firstborn, but there is a remembrance in modern Jewish seders of having those other plagues commemorated in different aspects. Okay, so now we're going to reflect on that with the events of the week between Palm Sunday and Easter. So again, the occurrence of the festival of Passover occurs usually right before we celebrate Easter. So in most years, the first day of Passover is going to fall between Palm Sunday and Easter, and that's because the Last Supper that Jesus has with his disciples is the Passover supper, right? He has the Passover meal that they would have had at the time with each other, and that he uses that meal and its symbolism to reflect upon his impending crucifixion. Okay, so we're going to do that as well. Okay, so I'm going to try to pair it up as we go between the plagues in Exodus and the events of the Holy Week. Okay, so on Monday of the Holy Week, we see, according to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and this is chapters, we're going to be talking about chapters 21 through about 24 of Matthew, chapters 11 through 15 of Mark, and chapters 19 through about 23 of the book of Luke is when we're really talking, that's where we see the events of the Holy Week occur. There's also chapters in John. John spends a lot of his book on the last week of Jesus' life, so we have all sorts of what's called the Olivet Discourse, and a lot of these parables that Jesus will tell occur in the book of John. And so it's going to be a little bit less than about half of the end. Well, the second half of the book of John really focuses on this one week as well. All right, so the first event, which happens on what's called Holy Monday, is when Jesus comes to the temple to cleanse it, right? He braids the whip and he flips over the tables and he casts out all of the tax collectors. And then also on Monday, there's the event of the cursing of the fig tree, which is a very interesting parable that we just do not have enough time to talk about tonight. In Matthew, the cleansing of the temple comes first, and then the cursing of the fig tree. And in Mark, it's the opposite way around. The cursing of the fig tree comes first, and then he records the cleansing of the temple. So what we can really gather from that is they both occur on the same day. And I will say that again, having to skip over a lot, the parable of the fig tree is kind of an interesting story, has a lot of parts. And so it's just they're remembering it or projecting it in their book a little bit differently. All right, so then on Holy Tuesday, so Tuesday of this week, what for us would be tomorrow, Jesus goes to the temple again after he cleanses it. And while he's there, he has a lot of discussions with the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the other religious leaders of the town. And this is called the authority of Jesus is challenged, right? He has all these people coming up to him and trying to challenge his right to be in the temple or to cleanse the temple or to preach even as well. So those first three events, the cleansing of the temple, the cursing of the fig tree, and Jesus's authority is challenged, I'm going to pair up with the water turning to blood. Now, the reason why I say that is we're going to do a little bit of what's called midrash, which is where you have to sort of interpret certain events that we see in the Old Testament in light of the New Testament or in light of our modern events, right? And so these three events all connect to the water turning to blood because this is the first time that we really see Jesus sort of moving out of a very popular mode within the Gospels to setting his face towards going towards the cross, right? So before this in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we see Jesus fairly popular with the people of Israel, right? So he's traveling around, healing people, raising people from the dead, preaching the gospel to them. And for the most part, the people in the Gospels like Jesus. But as he enters into Holy Week, the opposition to Jesus intensifies, right? And so we're going to see this sort of turn from one mode to another. And so I like to think of that a little bit like the water turning to blood, right? So we go from a favorable, consumable Jesus, one that refreshes us like water, to one that is unpalatable, undrinkable, and unconsumable, like the water, like the bitter water that's like blood. So that's my turn there as well. All right, so then the fourth station of Holy Week, which also occurs on Holy Tuesday, is that Jesus comes out after this challenge to his authority. He leaves the temple, goes out a gate, and starts climbing what's called the Mount of Olives, which faces Jerusalem. And it's there that he prophesies the destruction of destruction of Jerusalem, that he says that no stone that as they come out these ceremonial gates, that no stone that they pass is going to be left in place. And again, that overturn of what of the natural order is what I'm going to pair with the second and third plagues of Exodus, the plague of frogs and the plague of lice. So again, the turmoil of Jerusalem's destruction is paralleled or is reflected within these plagues, right? So just like the frogs are going to produce a stink in the house of the Egyptians, so Jesus and his ministry produces opposition for his own time, right? So he has quickly become an unpopular figure in Jerusalem. And just like the people who were afflicted by the lice in Egypt during the plagues, the people of Jerusalem will in turn be afflicted as well. So there is some evidence or some idea that the plague of frogs and the plague of lice are connected to each other, that one possibly caused the other, if we think of it in sort of like a scientific or a sort of natural explanation, that when all these frogs come and die in the households, that removes those predators from the world, and that allows this infestation of lice to occur. That the frogs were normally eating all of these bugs and keeping them down, and now we don't have them. So again, the two were connected in the time of Exodus, and they're connected here, as I'm sort of making my midrash, about the destruction of Jerusalem. So that the destruction of Jerusalem, the opposition that they have to him, will lead, Jesus is saying, to the destruction of their own city, and that they will also flee out as well. So then on Wednesday of this week, of Holy Week, we see that the religious leaders, the Sanhedrin, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, have decided that they have had enough of Jesus, and they are going to begin to plan for his death. And again, you can go to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and look at those depictions. What's very interesting here is that you have two groups, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who don't normally like each other. In fact, that's a major controversy that we see throughout the Gospels. We see it also through other literature from the 1st and 2nd centuries, in which the Pharisees and the Sadducees are usually opposite political parties, right? So we could think of them a little bit like our political parties, that they very rarely get along and they very rarely agree. And so that now that they have mixed their opinions together, they have become one big mass of anger against Jesus. I'm going to connect to that fourth plague of the wild beast, right? Remember that Hebrew word arov, which means mixture or confusion. That's what we're going to talk about here. That they have mingled themselves together in such a way as to basically have a bipartisan vote. The act passes, 100%, and they're all in agreement to be opposed with Jesus. Now, there is an exception here. There are two people in the Sanhedrin, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, who do not agree with the decision to execute Jesus, but they're outvoted, and the plan goes forward. Okay? So then we come to the sixth event of the Holy Week, which is also on Wednesday, and this is sort of separate. This is when Judas plans to betray Jesus, right? So he agrees to take 30 pieces of silver in exchange for revealing where Jesus is dwelling so that the temple guards can come and arrest him, right? And what's interesting about this one is that this event parallels or reflects on plagues 5 and 6. So plague 5 was the diseased livestock, that all the cattle developed disease, and plague 6 was the boils that afflicted the Egyptians themselves, right? And so what's interesting about this, the reason why I bring this together, is that while Judas is planning to betray Jesus, Jesus is not in Jerusalem. He's gone back to Bethany, which is sort of the town he's staying at during this week. He comes into Jerusalem and does some things, goes back to visit his friends Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, who live in a neighboring town called Bethany. And while Jesus is in the town of Bethany, while Judas is planning to betray him, Jesus is said to have been visiting Simon the leper, right? So we have Simon the leper, someone who is suffering from a skin disease, and that's going to parallel the boils, the skin disease that the Egyptians also were afflicted with, right? And again, this is a disease that affects everyone, right? So just as Judas has sort of taken upon himself the taint and the stain of being the betrayer of our Lord, and just as Jesus is being in the house of Simon the leper, we can sort of reflect or see a parallel there with those plagues which also afflicted and affected everything, both beast and man in Egypt. Right. So after Wednesday, we come to Thursday, and Thursday is the day in which the Passover meal would have been performed, right? So that first day of Passover, which is commemorating all of the plagues in the Bible, falls on Thursday. So we're running a little bit ahead now in terms of the New Testament compared to the 12 compared to the 10 plagues. But that plague, the Passover meal, is going to parallel, in this instance, plagues 7 and 8. Now, again, normally the Passover meal commemorates all 10, but I'm making it parallel here for my example with plagues 7 and 8. So the plague of hail and the plague of locusts, both of which destroy the crops. And I make that parallel because the Passover meal itself is produced of things that would come from the land, right? So part of the time, about the time of Jesus, the Passover meal has moved to combine the Feast of Unleavened Bread with this commemoration of the slaughter of the Paschal Lamb. And so in that meal, as we see within the Gospels, we have the eating of bread, the drinking of the fruit of the vine, which is usually wine, and also the eating of the lamb itself, right? And so the fruit of the vine, the juice or the wine, probably wine at the time of the first century, and the eating of unleavened bread is what we commemorate every Sunday in our church and in many churches with the communion. So our communion that we celebrate is a remembrance of this Passover meal. And what's interesting about that is that we use, since the time of Christ, the most simple elements of a meal to do it, right? We don't use fancy bread. We don't use fancy, fruit juice or whatever it is. We use something that even the poorest in Jesus's time would have had access to: bread and grape juice or wine. And so that commemoration is what levels us all out. It brings us all together and reminds us that we are dependent on God because he is the one who provides us even the base sustenance of our food, right? So everything from bread all the way up to our fancy foods, God has provided for us. And so here again in the plagues of Exodus with the hail and the locust, God has taken away those things. He has removed even the basic sustenance of the Egyptians in his plagues. But he has provided for his people, both in the Paschal lamb and in the fruit and in the bread, everything that they need to be sustained. All right, so then we get to plague 9, the plague of darkness for 3 days. Now this one's going to be a little bit more of a tighter fit for me because I had to sort of squeeze one in there in order to make it, work out appropriately at the end. So the event number 8 of the Holy Week is called Tenebrae. Now, Tenebrae is a Latin word which means the darkening or the coming of shadows. And so as we sit here in the evening with the sun setting and the shadows start growing long and the night approaches, that is the Tenebrae of the evening. And so for the Tenebrae, we are moving into the direction of the nightfall that Jesus has, right? He completes the meal and they go out into the garden to go to the Garden of Gethsemane to pray, and the night around them is what we're commemorating here. We can also see within the plague of darkness, 3 days of darkness for the Egyptian, is reflected in the 3 hours of darkness that we see when Jesus is crucified. He's going to die, and then after his death, for the next 3 hours, darkness falls upon Jerusalem, which would not have been missed by the people there, right? So again, remembering they're in the middle of Passover. They just had their Passover meal the previous day. They now crucify Jesus, and the sky goes dark, and they immediately probably remember that they're reminded of those plagues of Exodus that they just commemorated last night. Finally, we get to plague 10, the death of the firstborn, the one that motivates our understanding of or the festival of Passover itself. And here we're going to have 2 events that are connected: the denial of Peter and the crucifixion of Jesus. So again, Peter represents the first of all the apostles. He's the head of the apostles. Jesus says to him in Matthew, you are the foundation on which I'm going to build the church. You're going to be the head of all of this as I leave. But what does Peter do in the hour of decision when 3 times he's asked if he is one of the disciples? He says no. He denies that he even knows who Jesus is, and that rejection of Jesus reflects this denial of the firstborn. He is not going to claim to be one of his people. And then, of course, the crucifixion itself is itself the death of the firstborn. Just as Jesus is the firstborn son of Mary, right? So she was a virgin, and so he was her first child. And he is, of course, the Son of God. And we know in Colossians chapter 1 that he's called the firstborn of all creation. His death on the cross also reflects this commemoration of the death of the firstborn we see in Passover. So again, this was just sort of a reflection that I wanted to have, part of our practice session, but also because we're here in Holy Week, we're all ourselves separated. I'm not able to teach this to you live. I have to teach it to you through Zoom because we're all inside because of a pestilence and a plague that's fallen upon our own land. And as we go up through this week, and as we think about the coming of the resurrection, we have to first see the crucifixion, which is going to be on Good Friday. We have to remember that out of death there comes life sometimes, that out of Christ's death we have our redemption and our salvation. And as we face with perhaps some fear or some discouragement, this time of social isolation and separation, we also are commemorating in our own ways as Americans a time of pestilence and plague in which we are called to be separated for our own protection and for the protection of those around us. And with that, I hope that you enjoyed our lesson tonight.